like to propose Mrs. Seaton, please.
I would like to second Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you. Over to Mrs. Seaton then.
Thank you very much for that. Welcome to today's meeting of the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I would like to remind everyone that's present that the meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can I ask all of you to ensure that your mobile phones are switched off or to silent, please? I'd like to welcome our visitor, Sue Whiting, who will speak at today's meeting. I have received apologies for Mr. Welsh and Mr. Bill is substituting. I've received apologies from Mr. Kaufman and Mr. Galton is substituting, and apologies from Amanda Wright and Mr. Jennings is substituting. Now I've come to the election of Deputy Chairman. As I have been elected as Chairman of this committee, I now ask for nominations of the position of Deputy Chairman.
I nominate Mrs. Deborah Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I second that nomination, Chair?
Thank you very much. Welcome, Mrs. Taylor. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on January the 15th are taken as read, and is that going to be agreed with everyone? Thank you very much. We have received a question from Sue Whiting on Standing Order 35. I'd like to invite Sue really to move to the table. Everyone should have a copy of the question and answer, which also has been provided to Sue Whiting, so these can be taken as read. I would like to remind members that no discussion is to be held on the question. Sue, would you like to ask a supplementary question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. You can ask one supplementary question from your original question, but I would highlight that your supplementary question should be on clarity to the reply you have been given and should not raise any new issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just, I'm concerned at the number. So I'd like to say how many appeals are heard each day, as I have noticed every time I come to County Hall, school appeals are being heard all day in Framland, and today is no exception. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I will now ask the officers whether they are able to respond to this question.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have with me the number of appeals that are heard each day, but what we do know is that we have had an increasing number of applications into the system, both for first-time admissions into school, but also of mid-term transfers to those who already had a place but want another one. So I can't give you the detail of the number each day, but there is an increase in the number of children in the system.
Thank you very much, Sue. You're welcome, obviously, to stay. We now move to item 5, questions asked by members under the standing order. I have received no questions from members. Thank you. We move to item 6, urgent items. I have not been notified of any urgent items. Now on to item 7. Declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Does any member have any interest that they wish to declare? Thank you. No interest declared. We now move to item 8, declarations of the party whip in accordance with Overview and Scrutiny Procedure Rule 16. Do any members have any declarations? No? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 9. Presentation of petitions under standing order. Now we have got a petition, but we're choosing not to take it at this moment because the petition relates specifically to our Agenda 11. So at the time of Agenda 11, we'll be asking Mrs. Mary Draycott to come and deliver her petition and also speak on the item for 3 minutes. Thank you. Item 10, Quarter 3 Performance Report, which is on page 15 to 24 of your agenda pack. Sharon Cook, Assistant Director of Children's Social Care, and Jane Moore, Assistant Director of Education and Early Help, will be presenting the report and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The report outlines for quarter 3 the data in respect of children's social care, early help and school. As members will hopefully see from the report that 27 measures have been reported on, 5 have improved, 18 show no significant change and 1 has declined. So if we go on to page 16 of the pack, what we can see is that from social care's perspective, there was a slight decrease in the quarter in the review case conferences of children subject to a child protection plan taking place on time. What I can report, as though that is a slight decrease, it's still a high percentage, and I can assure members that I've received a report from the safeguarding unit on the reason for any review conferences not taking place on time, and the majority of those were conferences that needed to be arranged to enable key members and family to attend, and on some occasions because the meeting wasn't quorate with the agencies that were there. So that's work that's being addressed, and that's the reason for those. The other key area that we have robust oversight on are children that become subject to the child protection plan for the second or subsequent time. What we can see is there's been a slight reduction in this quarter in the number of those cases, and a reduction is a good sign. What I can also reassure members of is that for December and February we had no repeat child protection plans, and for January 15%. So when we report on quarter 4 we will see a significant change to that number in the right direction. But that is an area of work that continues to have robust management oversight and audit of cases, so we understand clearly what that's about. Other information for children's social care are that we continue to perform well around placement stability. Our care leavers in suitable accommodation is a high figure. There is an issue that is being looked into, because on the data chart that's attached it shows that figure to be in the 80s, and we're reporting in the report on 91.8%. That is something that Stuart and the business intelligence team are exploring around what that's about, but our understanding is it's that high figure of 91.8%. Percentage of care leavers in education, employment and training has increased slightly, but is still an area that we, along with our nationally, it's an area that all authorities are continuing to do more work from, or on rather. And in relation to health, which are the other key indicators for children in care, we've seen a slight increase in the children who have their health assessment, their annual health assessment completed, including dental checks and the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. But they, although improving, are still areas that we're continuing to highlight because of our need to improve even further. Unless there's any specific questions on children's social care, Jane can go through the early help and education data.
It was quite a generic question, so I'm happy to wait.
Yes, if you'd like to go ahead. Oh, sorry. Dr. Benner.
Bremner, yeah. on point 13, I was just curious, just for information really, because it's obviously a very sensitive area. But I've underlined the word referral. And coming into the council, where do you get referrals from? Schools, families, parents, any spectrum of society?
Yes, we would get a referral regarding child sexual exploitation can come from a family member of the public, any of the key agencies that's involved with the child or young person, and we would include in there those youngsters that are already open to children and family services where a risk of CSE becomes an issue, and we would want to refer into our child sexual exploitation team.
And is it on our media that it's clear where people can refer? Just for obvious reasons.
I believe so. It's advertised on all our key websites, all key posters, reports, etc. Everything, you know, we believe that we publicise that. And there is a National CSE Awareness Day in March that we will be doing further work around to make sure that this topic is publicised.
Thank you, Chair. So if I can take you back to page 16, paragraph 14, we've outlined there our early help performance. So the number of families who are receiving support from our early help services has remained pretty much the same as the previous quarter. And there's no further update on our payment by results claim for SLF because we're not due to submit another one. So we're still at 31% of our overall claim target. If I can take you now to paragraph 19 to 21, which outlines our performance around first-time entrants, reoffending and custody. And again, all three of those measures remain strong. We, this quarter, again, have had low numbers of first-time entrants coming into the criminal justice system, and our reoffending rate per young offender, again, remains relatively low. It's slightly higher than last period, but still remains relatively low. And our use of custody, again, remains low. In terms of education quality, I've outlined in paragraph 22 the data around our free early education entitlement, and you'll note the information item at the back of the papers which sets out the work that we've been doing in this area that we're particularly pleased with. And again, you'll note from this performance report that 88% of our eligible two-year-olds are now accessing their free early education entitlement. That's 1,406 children. And it's well above the national figure, so we're particularly pleased with the rollout of that. In relation to schools, we now have 88.7% of our schools rated as good or outstanding. That's 249 out of our 281 schools, and 88.9% of our children are attending a good or outstanding school. And again, we've broken down that into primary and secondary, and you can see that the Ofsted gradings for primary schools rated good or outstanding is 89.1 and secondaries is 84.8, and all of our secondary schools are special schools, sorry, are good or outstanding. In terms of vulnerable groups in education, the data for our Key Stage 4 children in care is now available. The Progress 8 figure for this cohort is minus 1.28, which whilst it is better than last year's figures, still remains below what it is for the Leicestershire average. And then finally, our NEET figures for the whole county remains good, so there are only 2.2% of young people who are not in education, training or employment. However, the figure for those with special educational needs is slightly lower at 3%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd be a little concerned at the department losing focus with the performance reports here in this instance, and to the times we've looked at the Ofsted action plan. I'd be interested to know how you intend to mesh those two together, whether any of your performance indicators may change as a result of the Ofsted action plan.
I can answer that, Chair. The indicators that are reported to this committee on the quarterly performance report are part of the indicators that we look at as part of our Ofsted Action Plan. And as committee members will know, I've presented and will be presenting to the next meeting of this committee the update on our progress against the 17 Ofsted recommendations. So those performance data, that data that we've just gone through, is part of the Ofsted Action Plan. But the Ofsted Action Plan actually includes far more performance data.
I think kind of makes my point. If this is a subset of the Ofsted Action Plan, there may be something within the Ofsted Action Plan that you might want to bring forward into your performance indicators moving forward.
Yeah, this is not a subsection of that action plan. This is the statutory returns that we have to provide for children's social care. Our Ofsted Action Plan includes these performance indicators and data, but also includes things that are specific to what we're working on in Leicestershire.
Does that mean that we only put in the performance plan what's the statutory requirement? Do we not have any discretion to put in something that we think is important to the local measure?
So yeah, we can do that. Obviously, it's important that we report on the statutory ones because we have to return those. The Ofsted Action Plan, some of the points in there relate to infrastructure changes and things, and once they're completed, as it were. But we're always open to review any performance information that we report here and can update it as appropriate. So, for instance, things that's probably had a much higher profile in the last year or two, maybe around reporting on CSE cases and things like that. So, yes, the answer is we can always go back and review what we report to committee. It's a live thing, but there are some pretty standard things that we always refer to, and for most of my career we've been referring to as kind of key pieces of performance information, like number of contacts, referrals, number of assessments, speed of assessments, stability of placements. These are pretty kind of standard reports that have been around for a long period of time and I think remain relevant.
I would like to ask a question, please, on the item 20, the rate of reoffending. Sorry, it's under the children and young pupils and their families live within thriving communities. Number 20, the rate of reoffending. What involvement do we have at the moment that they reoffend? I mean, can we make any impact?
Yeah, so the Youth Offending Service supports young people who are both at risk of reoffending but also at risk of offending. So this rate is a measure of those people who have already offended. Will have some intervention from youth offending officers depending on their court order or their outcome. And the Youth Offending Service officer will support those young people in reducing the likelihood of reoffending. So what this figure shows us is how successful we've been at doing that. So this monitors the rate of reoffending per offender. So the lower the better. So in short, the answer is yes, we do provide a really intensive intervention to young people to support them from either reducing their reoffending or coming away from offending at all.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions on this item? No? I suggest that it's noted, please. Thank you. Right, we'll be moving on to item 11, consultation on the proposed early help review, which is on page 2562 of your agenda pack. Jane Moore, Assistant Director, Education and Early Help, will present the report and answer any questions. So there will be a presentation. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I've put together a presentation on the paper because I've included some additional information in on top of the paper as just at being asked, but also some wider information that we have available. So just by way of reminder, the purpose of this report is to seek the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Commission's views on the proposed changes to early help service. We are currently in a consultation period. That consultation was launched on the 22nd of January and will run for a period of 13 weeks, so it will close on the 22nd of April. So the purpose of this presentation and paper is to share the views about the proposed changes, but also to gain feedback and suggestions on the proposals. So just by way of background, the review is seeking to achieve the 3.8 million savings that are required by 1920 across all of our early help services. And that 3.8 million is made up of the 1.5 million MTFS targets that we've had for some time within the medium-term financial strategy, and also the 2.3 million funding gap in supporting Leicestershire families as a result of the ending of the DCLG grant and partner contributions and SLF reserves. So there are 4 services which are planned to be reviewed as part of these proposals. They're the Supporting Leicestershire Families Service, our Children's Centre programme, our Youth Offending Service, and our Early Help Information and Advice Service. And we've detailed a bigger overview really of each of those services and what those services currently does in one of the appendices to the report. So in relation to the proposals, we've set out 2 proposals to achieve the savings, the first of which is to merge our 4 early help services into one single service, a 0 to 19 service, and do that by creating efficiencies, but also what we think will be a far better joined up service. And the second proposal is to reduce the number of buildings that we currently have within the early help service from 40 down to 15. And again, I've outlined in the presentation the proposed savings overview, and you'll note that the far greater proportion of savings will come from staffing. So we are looking to take 3.1 million out of staffing and 0.7 million out of running costs. So that's essentially the money we would save through closing our buildings. So just a little bit more detail around the proposals for the service. We are looking at developing a 0 to 19 family wellbeing service, and this new proposed model would look to not only integrate our existing areas together into a single service, but look at providing some a core age-related offer, very much targeted at vulnerable children and their families. We are proposing that the new model would provide a whole family service. It would provide an effective assessment to identify needs and then deliver appropriate services. It would deliver a targeted offer from locality bases and teams operating from the 15 proposed buildings. We are looking at incorporating flexible delivery in people's homes and also from community centres, and we're looking to offer support through a range of things. So looking at offering support through group work, through individual support, so that's one-to-one support delivered by a worker, and also drop-in clinics across the county as well. So if I may just go on to our early help buildings. As I said earlier, we currently have 40 early help buildings across the county, 36 of which are our children's centre buildings and 4 of which are our supporting Leicestershire Families buildings. Just by way of reminder, our early help services are delivered, as I said, by 4 different services, and the majority of our services are not delivered within buildings. In fact, the majority is delivered both within people's homes or through group work in other venues. So our Children's Centre programme does deliver work through our Children's Centre buildings, but it does deliver a huge range of work as outreach in people's homes, certainly for those that aren't able to access our children's centres or for those who require more intensive support as well. Our Supporting Leicestershire Families delivers the majority of their work in people's homes, but does deliver some group work within those 4 SLF buildings. And our Youth Offending Service delivers support in children and young people's homes and uses community venues for some of the things like our panels and group work. And our Early Help Information Assessment and Support Service is delivered from here at County Hall and also outreach in people's homes. What I've put up here is just a snapshot of where our current buildings are. So you can see on the slide behind me the current coverage we have of the county of our early help buildings. So that details where the 40 buildings currently are. What I've then got behind me is the map of our current buildings, and where you can see a dark red colour, those are our more deprived areas of Leicestershire, going down into the lighter area, which is our 20 to 30% most deprived areas. And again, we've mapped our current buildings onto our deprived ward areas for you there. So in terms of making a decision about where our family wellbeing centres should be, where we're proposing that they should be, and just by way of reminder, we are currently consulting on these proposed locations at the moment. We've included a number of different areas for rationale. So we have looked at how the buildings are located across the county. We've looked at how accessible locations are, and both from the building in terms of nearby towns and villages, and we've had to look at that about how accessible they are by foot, by car, and also public transport. We have had to look at the running costs of buildings, and you'll note from the attached sheet that you've had given to you last week, there's a varying difference in the cost of running the buildings across the county. We've also had to look at whether we own the building, whether it's leased, and how flexibly the building can be used going forward. We've also had to look at how suitable the building is. So we do have staff that we will need to locate within our buildings, as well as deliver group work from our buildings. So we have had to look at whether or not those buildings have adequate office space from which we can deliver outreach in people's homes and base our staff from. And we've also done a thorough analysis and are continuing to analyse how people currently use our services and how people currently both access our buildings and use those buildings as well. And that includes looking at whether people drive to our buildings, how many walk to our buildings, and how many we currently transport into our buildings as well. So again, detailed in the report is the list of the 15 buildings that we are proposing to use going forward. And we've proposed 5 hubs, so those will be the main buildings from which our staff are based from, and we will deliver group work, and we're proposing 10 spokes across the county as well. Now, we have identified areas that we think those buildings should be based in, and you'll see that we've listed a preferred building in each of those areas as well. Now, obviously, this is a key part of the consultation, and we are currently receiving feedback on this proposed locations as part of the consultation. What I've then done is mapped the hubs and spokes onto our deprivation, what we know about deprivation in Leicestershire. So again, you can see how closely those proposed buildings align to current areas of deprivation across the county as well. What I've then detailed is the early help service users. So we've done an analysis of where all of our early help service users live across the county, and we've mapped that against the buildings. And as you can see, our proposed buildings, which are the blue circles, very closely align with the yellow clusters, which is where the majority of our early help services live, service users live. So part of the rationale for why we've proposed the buildings that we've proposed is based on where we know our existing referrals come from, and as close as possibly to align those service users to the buildings as well. The next slide, I've done an overview of the numbers of children's centre involvement, and again I'll come on to the sheet that you've got with further detail on it, but essentially it shows you the amount of involvement we have across each district. So the dark blue line is the family support work delivered through Children's Centre, which is our brief intervention. The red line is our one-to-one intervention. The green lines is our universal, so that's those families who come in and use the centres for predominantly services that are delivered either by other agencies or by volunteers within our centres. The purple line is our Children's Centre pathway, so that's our very targeted pathway that we will be wanting to take with us into the future model. And the blue, the lighter blue line is our Children's Centre groups. We've provided some further information, and you should have an Excel spreadsheet handed out to you, or certainly sent to all members last week, which gives you far greater detail about how we're currently using our children's centres across the area. So what it does is it sets out by building the opening times of those buildings. It gives you the information about the number of service users over the 12 months. And we've broken that down into targeted. So the targeted involvement is predominantly what we deliver. It is the work that we do with our most vulnerable families in terms of our pathway, but also our group work programmes, and where we deliver individual work in our children's centre buildings. And it also includes our special educational needs and disability groups that we run within our children's centres as well. The universal, as I've said, is predominantly that those services that are delivered by other organisations or by volunteers, and that obviously you can see that's a far greater number. So that's delivered by predominantly health visitors, volunteer-led sessions, but also some community groups as well. We've detailed the usage, so we've detailed what's currently being run, and obviously this does change regularly, but what's currently run at each centre on a weekly basis, but also we've detailed for you which other organisations use those centres regularly as well. And then the final bit of information is the buildings information, so it gives you the address, the tenure of the building, the running costs, and who owns the building as well. So just some further information on impact assessment. We had done some work prior to going out to consultation in order to understand use of our centres, and that's how we got to the proposal that we've put forward. However, what's really important to stress is that the consultation is primarily about understanding the impact, both on service users, on partners, on a whole range of people, on the proposals we're making, both in terms of the service model and also the building change as well. So some of the things that we're being told or finding out about as part of the consultation is about the potential impact on increased travel, how people will access services in the future, where groups could run from, and also really understanding what the impact is of the proposals that we're making. So obviously as part of that part of the consultation and part of understanding the impact, we will then be able to think about how we develop the model going forward. We're also gathering and assessing information on our current services. So we are looking in more detail about our current user data by centre, types of service, and also how people currently access our service. So we are able to look at how much people already travel to access the services, and how many people actually walk to the buildings, and how many people indeed don't access our buildings at all but receive an early help service. We have had a long look at our transport routes and how people could in the future get to the buildings, but actually how people currently get to buildings as well. And also understanding the services that are delivered by us and also by our partners and volunteers. And the results of all of the consultation, both in terms of this further research, but also feedback from people, will be used to shape the future delivery model. Also, as part of the consultation, we are working closely with our partners. So we are having ongoing discussions with key partners to understand how their services can support the future delivery model, and where we can continue to deliver things jointly. But also, we are looking at how our proposed services may change and reduce any potential impacts on their delivery as well. And where we are jointly delivering services from children's centres, there's a potential that they will still continue to deliver those services, but from other buildings as well. Just a brief overview around transport. Within the current model, we do transport a large number of service users into our building, usually by taxi. So we do have a breakdown of those people who currently walk to our centres, but those who, as I said earlier, we would taxi. And often those are families or who need to attend a course or intensive support but don't have access to transport, and actually don't have a centre nearby at the moment either for them. So we already transport people in. We think that will still be the case in the new model, that those families who require intensive support or certainly can't access centres, if they still need to go to a centre, we will transport them in. We have considered the transport costs, but think that that will it won't outweigh the current building running costs. And we do intend to support, as we do now, delivery through other community venues. So we already use community halls, we use libraries, we use a whole range of buildings to deliver our programmes through, and we have no intention of stopping doing that within our new model. Just by way of information, we have had a look at a number of other local authorities to see what they're doing, both in terms of their troubled families money ending, but also their children's centres. So we regularly meet with colleagues across the region around troubled families and have had a number of conversations with people around what they're proposing to do in light of the ending of the grant. There are very few other local authorities who have a pooled budget as ours. We were very successful early on at building quite a big service to deliver the troubled families programme, but most authorities are making similar plans to us to end the services that are delivered through that DCLG grant. In relation to children's centres, we've been in touch with around about 7 different authorities to understand not only the cuts that they're having to make in a similar way that we're doing within Leicestershire, but certainly learning from how they've done it and the number of centres that they've gone down to. So it's not unusual that there are reductions in children's centres across the country, and we've worked closely, certainly with Leicester City more recently, and other neighbouring authorities to help understand not only the impact of what they've done, because they may be a little further ahead than us, but also to understand how they've done it as well. And then just finally, a little bit on the consultation. The consultation, as I said, does run for 13 weeks. It started on the 22nd of January and it runs until the 22nd of April. And the key audiences, and those of whom we are already receiving a great deal of input from, are our service users, our early help staff and our stakeholders and partners. And we're also holding a number of public consultation events across the county in March and April, and those events start from next week, where members of the public are being invited to come along and meet with chief officers and members to have a discussion around certainly understanding the impact and understanding some of the plans in more detail. So just to conclude, the report that I've presented to you does outline the requirement to make the savings, which equate to 3.8 million. We've set out 2 proposals to achieve those savings. That's the merger of our 4 services into one, and also reducing the number of service delivery buildings from 40 to 15. And the results of the consultation will be fed into the service development process with a final report to Cabinet in the summer of 2018. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you very much for that. Before we discuss the report, I would like to draw your attention to the statements from Save Our Children's Centres, Leicestershire, which is tabled before you at this meeting. So just draw your attention to the questions on this sheet. Thank you very much. We have received, as I said earlier, we've received a petition regarding the proposed closure of Cobden Children's Centre. I would like to welcome Mrs. Mary Draycott to the meeting. Mrs. Draycott, please introduce the terms of your petition, and would you like to briefly say a few words? I ask you to speak for no more than 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And can I also, first of all, thank the Scrutiny Committee for letting me speak on this matter today. I, along with the 210 signatories on the petition, object to the proposal to cut the 24 children's centres across Leicestershire, particularly the Cobden Sure Start Children's Centre in Hastings, Ward Loughborough, which I represent, and I wish to present the petition after I finish speaking. As I'm sure all of the members know, children's centres provide valuable services which benefit the vulnerable and potentially vulnerable members of our communities. To lose these services will impact disproportionately on women and children in areas of deprivation and poverty. Without such services, many problems only emerge later in life. If future parents do not get the chance to lead a full and productive life, how can they themselves bring up families in the future? This proposal will cost more long term. Such cuts to these important support services would widen the gap for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, which increases the unfairness of this cut. The report even accepts that cutting such preventative work will carry a real risk of creating additional service pressures and costs of mainstream care services in the future, as well as on health and education, plus affecting partner agencies. The Hastings Children's Centre, which is ideally attached to the Cobden Primary School, allows parents to use both easily, and they do so. It is held in high respect, and parents who have and who are using the services provided value its work. One parent signing the petition stated, and I quote, "Yes, I would definitely sign. Without the Cobden's Children's Centre, I would never have got my child back home." Chair, end of quote. The part of Hastings Ward where the Children's Centre is cited is the most deprived in Loughborough. It has a 45% child poverty level, and that was recently announced with the national statistics, and this figure sadly is increasing over the years, so the trend shows that the need is there. The Cabinet member for Children's and Families on television recently confirmed that some families would lose out on these proposals if agreed. He quoted that if 8 full-time posts were to go, all of their caseload would not be carried out. Finally, Chair, commenting on the proposal as a whole, it is clear to me that it carries a high risk of creating a patchwork of services with sharp inequalities hampering it and laced with hidden costs both in financial terms and by the way of impact upon society. I urge the County Council to reconsider this drastic action, and whilst I would want all of them to remain open, I am a realist, knowing that this is only happening due to central government's financial cuts. So I ask that at the very least, keeping those with the highest need should be the priority. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Draycott. I believe you want a photo while you're handing over the petition, yes? I shall open up the floor to any questions. Yes, Mr. Sheehan.
Yeah, I've got a few questions, not perhaps as many as I would have had, because a lot of them have been answered already through the extra documents that have been produced. So thank you very much to the officers for that. Just a couple of easy questions, well, hopefully easy questions first of all. You've got figures here in the list of this rather large document here. I don't know what you'd call it, but the running costs. There's an example here where comparing Measham and Moira, the running costs are almost exactly the same, but for about £400. And I'm just wondering, with one being leased and the other being LCC owned, how you've arrived at such closely comparable figures. That's the first question.
Sorry, Mr. Sheehan, just to clarify the question.
Well, the point is, if one's being leased, you'd expect there to be some extra costs in there because you have to pay for the lease unless it's done on a peppercorn basis, in which case I could understand the running costs being similar. But I thought there might be a discrepancy because of the different nature of the tenure. Is there any explanation for that?
No, the cost that we've detailed in the final column of the spreadsheet details the entire running costs. So where we're leasing, that might include rent and running costs, but it depends on the size of the building, it depends what else we're running there. So those are the entirety of the running costs. I'm not sure the detail of why they're so close, but those are the entirety of running costs. Some of them, we pay the entire cost to those who we're leasing, so we might pay the cleaning costs and everything directly to the people we're leasing from, whereas the LCC, it would include all of the running costs in that cost. If that makes sense.
I'll accept a breakdown of the figures if that's possible after the meeting from Jane, if that's okay. On the heat map, where you've got the different shades of red, sort of very, very bold red, sort of very slightly anemic red, and then the sickly looking pink. You've got a very, I think for Braunston, particularly, I know bits of the county, I don't know the whole county, but there's bits that stick out in my mind from previous exercises in North West Leicestershire, but I'd have thought Braunston was one of the more needy areas, and yet it's only in the top 20 to 30% where there are areas of need. I'm just a bit surprised at that. Is any comments on that?
It's the top 20 to 30% of national figures, but also I think where it's most dark red in the south of the city is the area of Braunston. So that would be the top 10 most deprived, where the darkest bit of red is.
Do we serve those communities or not with our children's centre? Because we're right in the boundary.
Yeah, we serve everything that's got the red or pink colours on them.
So deprived bits of Braunston, people from those areas don't get to use our children's centre, is that what you're saying?
No, sorry, I was just pointing to the dark colours to the south of the city, which are in the county. So those will be our areas of the county that are most deprived. But you're right, there are areas of the city which is doesn't have any colour on it. Obviously, it's the bit in the middle of our county. There will be people from the city, no doubt, accessing centres because some of it will be drop-in. I was referring to the colours just below the city, which is within the county and demonstrates some of the 10% most deprived areas in the county there.
Yeah, but looking where they're located, they're far away from Braunston, really. They're different communities altogether. I just wonder if we've really taken into account properly the level of deprivation that that children's centre in Braunston serves. Number 26 on the map.
We'll need to go back and have a look at it further. I mean, it's national data, so we've taken account of the data that we have around the deprivation affecting children across the county. And yeah, we can have a look in more detail at the data, but obviously this is just the county data and it doesn't record the data of the deprivation in the city.
I welcome the offer to take another look at that. I think it's important for Braunston. Now, I understand that the outcome of the consultation, the information that comes back from the consultation will influence the decision over whether centres should close, in fact, whether you've identified the correct ones for closure. Are you able to sort of give us any sort of clue as to what might change your mind at this stage?
No, I think I think what's really important to say is that the consultation is about understanding the impact of the proposed changes and whether or not there are any really strong rationale for changing the buildings that we're proposing. So obviously at the moment we have a list of buildings that we're proposing that we would look to redesignate. It may be that as a result of the consultation people tell us that we've got those buildings in the wrong area, that there are some really strong reasons why we ought to still keep that building open. So that's what's coming in at the moment from the consultation, so we'll be happy to hear where people have any reservations around the buildings that we're proposing and what alternative buildings might be better set to deliver from.
This meeting is part of the consultation, so I'm hoping that you'll look at, I mean, we talked about this at full council. Councillor Pendleton mentioned about it's about services, not buildings. I think he was actually trying to say that I was implying that. Well, I got that impression. But what I would also say is that communities matter, and the location of buildings within those communities matter. So if you've got deprivation and you take away that building, then you're losing an awful lot of service for those people that perhaps need it. And I also like to hear a little bit more about what work you're proposing to do with third parties, and by that I include schools. to come up with viable plans to maintain services to the local community, because I think that's a possible way forward for some of them, even if you can't keep them open as children's centres. I'd also like to hear a little bit more about what we've actually learnt from neighbouring or other authorities on their proposals to close children's centres. You said you'd looked at them. I just wonder what lessons you've taken from that so far.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the first bit. In terms of the building rationale, the other bit that I didn't add is that obviously when we're looking at the buildings, we do have the ability to look at how many people walk to those buildings already. So as you say, how much they are used by members of the community, or how many people are already travelling a significant distance to use that building. So part of our consideration will be how much that building is used by local community members as well as those that travel in. And we'll look at that as part of the consultation. So we'll be able to do that as breakdown by each children's centre to understand the distance travelled. And part of the understanding of impact will be understanding how else we might deliver services to those communities if we no longer run the children's centre. So, for example, in a lot of the communities, there are community centres that aren't children's centres, there are community halls, there are other venues that may be as good enough to deliver services from. And again, that's what's coming through the consultation as well, to help us understand whether or not we've got the proposed buildings right. In terms of third parties, we are looking at whether there are options for the buildings that we're proposing. And obviously, we are in the period of consultation, so there's no decisions yet about which buildings. But we do want to make sure that should we get to the point where we're not using 25 of the buildings, that we do have alternative plans ready to be discussed for those buildings. So as you know, and as you can see from the spreadsheet that we've sent around, a lot of the buildings are on school sites, so we're having conversations with schools about how they may use the buildings. A lot of schools are talking to us about early years provision and continuing to use those buildings as early years providers. That doesn't then mean that we can't still deliver group work from those buildings, because they'll still be open as community venues. And also other organisations who may well be interested in using the building for community purposes. So again, part of the consultation is about working with communities to understand how they may use those buildings differently. And then the final question, in terms of what we've learnt from neighbouring authorities, we've learnt a number of things, I think. One of the early learning is that the Leicestershire was already in a place where we had made our children's centre programme very targeted. So other authorities were making changes to their children's centre programme, which we had probably done a number of years ago. So our children's centre programme is already very targeted, so we don't use local authority staff to deliver universal provision, whereas a lot of the local authorities that were delivering or making similar sized cuts were cutting some of the universal provision, so they were developing a targeted service. So whilst it was useful, we weren't able to glean from them how to take out further resources from services that were already targeted. What we did learn from neighbouring authorities was the importance of consultation and importance of really understanding the impact of those services and service cuts. And it's been very useful to work with local authorities to understand the process they've been going through as well.
If I may, I mean, I hope one of the things we've learnt is that it's not easy to close children's centres, and in fact in many cases they've had to back off because of the opposition and the case that's been made. One thing that I don't know if other authorities have come up with any answer to how they avoid the possibility of capital clawback. I know it's not being taken that seriously as a risk, but I mean, if some clever person issued a writ of mandamus against the government, I think that's the right wording, from my A-level law, which is a long time ago, and they actually had to move forward and act on clawing this money back, then what defence would we have if we'd closed something on the basis that we thought they just ain't going to do this?
The strategy we're taking is to work towards understanding when capital clawback would apply. So we know that capital clawback would apply if we do not use the building for 60% of its original use. So we're not working on the basis of avoiding capital clawback, we're working on the basis that we would want to continue using those buildings for that purpose. So we know that there's a risk of capital clawback if we aren't able to make plans that are not children's centre buildings but using the buildings for 60% sort of early years targeted related work. If we aren't able to do that, then yes, there is a risk of capital clawback, and we would have to, I'm not sure how well we'd be able to defend that position. What we do know nationally is that there's only been a few instances of capital clawback happening. Now, what we don't know is if that's because they've been able to hit the 60%, or whether that's because the government isn't clawing back. What we're looking at the moment is how we could develop alternative uses for buildings that include the keeping the building being used for 60% of its original use.
Can I just add something in on that, just to set the context? One of the authorities that did have some clawback was actually Northamptonshire, which I understand was quite a small amount. But the other thing to remember on this is we've got two different elements here. One is about revenue costs, ongoing revenue costs, and one is capital costs. So hopefully we won't have any clawback. If we do have clawback, it's in the sense of a capital repayment. We've still got the ongoing issue of we can't fund the revenue costs. So whilst we've highlighted this element in the report, the reality is if we can't afford the revenue cost to run the buildings are going to be empty anyway. Do you see what I mean? So it's not a case for the fact that we shouldn't do this because there might be capital clawback, because the thing is we can't do it because we haven't got the revenue costs to be able to run the centres. One element of part of that would be there might be some one-off capital clawback involved in that, but we think the risk of that is very low given the scale of cutbacks that have occurred all over the country, and the level of capital clawback has been very, very small.
I only make the point because it does really blow a big hole in the savings if this is pursued by the government. And maybe Northamptonshire are unlucky. This would be very unlucky. Everything to do with finance. But
can I just ask Chris Thomas to come in here and contribute towards this? Thank you.
Yeah. Just on a couple of your points. Chris Thomas, I'm head of the Early Help Service. One of the things you mentioned about Braunston, and it's Braunston Town, so the deprivation in Braunston Town I think is quite different to actually Braunston, the part in the city. And I know the point you're making to some of the service users cross-use the service, but the actual deprivation levels as in that we're looking at, so Braunston Town is slightly different to Braunston City. And then on you asked the question and Jane gave an answer around learning from other authorities, but one of the areas that I would cover is that a lot of other authorities, so we looked at quite a lot of other authorities that have gone down this line already, and a lot of them looked, rather than going into the micro communities, were looking at broader localities and delivering a service in the broader localities. That's the approach that a lot of authorities have gone down, and obviously that's our hub and spoke model, if you like, having a hub and some smaller buildings in a particular area. That is an approach taken by quite a number of other authorities. Just add that as a bit of detail.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It just remains to be said that some gaps are harder to plug than others when it comes to closing a children's centre. Just keep that in mind.
Paul?
Can I just come back on this capital thing and the savings? I think it's a really important point. It will not blow a hole in the savings because the savings are required for revenue. Capital is dealt with in a different way. So I think that's the point I was trying to make. We're not saying it's not a risk, it's in the report as a risk, but it's very difficult, and it will not blow a hole in the long-term savings, which are revenue costs.
That might be true when you look at a balance sheet, but I think in the public perception it does make a difference.
Mrs. Page.
Thank you. That certainly gave it a good airing, and it helped to answer quite a few questions. But may I just raise a couple of points? First of all, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. I think that really explained a lot to me. So, and also, thank you, Chairman. I think it was very magnanimous of you to allow that petition. As we well know, the cut-off date is 500, but it did give us a little bit of an insight how other people feel, and that is what it is all about, providing we don't set a precedence here. Now, I'm fully well aware that some of the things are not popular, but in my mind, this is the best we can get, because what we're actually proposing is we're not proposing to cut the services or losing services, i.e. like Northampton to close all of them. What we're doing here, it is trying to have a new model to ensure continuous delivery. And I have to thank the officers, because I think, considering the scale of the savings we have to make and the financial pressures we're under, it's quite good. And I'm very pleased to see a different model rather than proposing a lot of cutbacks or total closures. Now, my only point is, if I'm looking at the proposed building and location and the proposed spokes, the slide you've got, yeah, and I compare that to the following slide of current service users, my first initial thought is, why have we got Hinckley as having a hub and Melton as having a hub, when Melton, the service users are quite low? So, you see, now what I need from you, Jane, it is an explanation. What are the hubs actually doing? Because there are spokes everywhere. So what are the hubs in relation to the spokes? Yeah, I can't get my head around that. So explain the setup to me, because in my mind, I would have thought Harborough, for instance, it has got far higher users, so there should be a hub rather than a spoke. So can you just talk me through it to understand that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick some of it up, and I'm sure Chris will add as well. Part of the role of the hub, as I said, is about providing a base for our members of staff. So should we not have had a hub in Melton, we wouldn't have anywhere where we would be looking at basing our staff from. So some of it is about where we would base staff from so that they can deliver outreach into communities, but some of it is that where we can deliver our group work programme from. And you'll note that in some areas there are buildings that are relatively close together, and again that's about us being able to house the number of staff we have, think about the numbers of groups that we need to run, and certainly the ease of access for service users to the buildings as well. So the hub's role is twofold really. One is it's to deliver our programmes from where we do deliver programmes within buildings, but also it's a building from which staff across the early help services and other services may well be based from. The spokes role is predominantly around buildings for delivery of intervention, so group work programmes and community delivery as well.
If I may come back, Chairman. So what we're saying, it is actually Wixton is closest to Harborough, so the staff that is working in Harborough would probably have to commute to the hub in Wixton, or are they situated there? Because I still can't get the relation of the, spoke and the hub, because it looks like everything is covered. You see, I'm just confused.
The staff in Market Harborough, we're proposing that we retain the Children's Centre within Market Harborough, so there will be staff based there. What we need to bear in mind is that the buildings that we're proposing as spokes are often a little bit smaller, so don't have as much staff ready, but no, there will still be staff based at the Market Harborough Children's Centre if that's the centre we keep. We also have staff based at Market Harborough Borough Council, which we would hope to keep as well. So these are staff wouldn't have to travel too far across the county.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. I do have 4 questions for you, so I'll try and get them as clearly as I can. There's quite a bit of mention about that you already use community centres already to offer services and groups there. Have you got a cost of what that actually costs the service each year for our, I presume we rent that space when we use it by the hour or whatever. So have you got a cost of that, and how much is that cost likely to go up if we do close some centres, then having to use more community buildings? What's the forecast of how much additional that will cost us each year? My second point is that in the paper that you've given us of what happens at each children's centres, that you're saying that a lot of them are health activities that are there. Do the NHS or their health pay for that uses of that Shore Start Centre, or is it just given free for them to use? That is my second point. The third point you've already raised, really, but I think we should really look at it again, that in Loughborough and Coalville we have a hub and we have a spoke building within really close locations of others, but we've got other huge gaps within the county that have nothing at all. So I know what you're saying about staff location, but I think that really needs looking at again, that we shouldn't have two buildings very close to each other in the same towns when we've got huge gaps in other areas. And my fourth point is about the two centres that are located in the community managed libraries, so that's Fleckney and Anstey. And what I don't want to see happen is that those short centres to reduce and then both those community libraries fall down, because they're relying on that income from housing those Shore Start centres to provide the community library. So I'd be really interested in what the thoughts are for those two centres. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to your first question, I don't have the costs to hand around the what we spend currently on renting buildings, and it is likely that the cost of renting community buildings will go up. However, what we do think is that cost will not outweigh the costs of saving in running buildings. So it costs us more to run our buildings than it does to rent a village hall or something by the hour. But I don't have those costs now, but certainly can get them. In terms of the health contribution, yes, the our health colleagues use our children's centre buildings and have done for some time now, and don't make a direct rent payment for those buildings. We've been using them as shared community buildings. So no, there isn't a direct rental cost from health colleagues at the moment. And I'll just pick up the last one whilst we're on that with libraries. A really key part of the consultation is understanding the impact on other organisations should we stop using those as children's centres, and we're well aware of the potential impact on the two libraries of the removal of our revenue costs in running them, and are exploring and working with that at the moment. And some of that's about us really understanding the impact of us removing our services from those buildings and no longer running children's centres. And then again, the question you've asked around Loughborough and Coalville, yes, we have proposed both a hub and a spoke within Loughborough and Coalville. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of that is about need in those areas. So there are a large group, as you've seen from the slides with the orange and blue dots on, there are a large number of service users within Coalville and Loughborough. Also, one of the main considerations we've had to make around the buildings is accessibility and travel. And as you will be aware, the travel network across Leicestershire allows far greater access to our towns across Leicestershire. We don't already have coverage of our children's centre programme, so there are already areas of the county that don't have children's centres and never had children's centres, so thereby removing them we'll have exactly the same issue. So what we've done in proposing the hubs and spokes is tried to make buildings in areas where not only do most of our early help service users live, but where people can access easily, as well as the issue around where we place our staff.
If I just add a couple of points. From an operational perspective, because we're going out into consultation, it's been hard to draw up any really detailed plan, because we wanted to see what the feedback was. But in relation to the answer to your first question, we very much want that flexibility in being able to use rent space in areas, but it depends where we end up finally with our proposals and what the public say back to us. But certainly our plan is that we will want to have a more flexible model and that ability to use other community buildings. But it's very difficult to draw up any detailed plan until we get to the end of the consultation and we properly look at the feedback.
I'd be grateful of those figures about how much we spend on community buildings at the moment and what forecasting you've done as to likely what future costs are going to be, because obviously that's going to impact on the savings that are stated within this report. So I would be really interested in that. And within that consultation, will the NHS be feeding back? Because obviously if they don't pay a cost at the moment to use those buildings and their buildings are going to shut, they're going to have to find somewhere else within their community. What impact it's going to have on their budgets as well, because they're obviously going to have to pay for space as well.
Yes, so that's part of the consultation. We're working with our partners to understand that, because obviously we've had a very close working relationship with our colleagues within the Leicestershire Partnership Trust who are delivering from our buildings. So again, we would want to understand from a partnership point of view what the impact of us no longer having those buildings, or certainly providing the revenue to run those buildings from, would be. So it's part of the consultation.
Just to make the point about savings, this is all about, we need to make those savings, and we will make those savings one way or another. So even if we're paying more in certain areas, we still have to reduce the service to deliver the savings. So it won't be, if we start to pay more for community buildings outside, we're not going to save the 1.5 million, we'll save 1.4 million. We still have to save the 1.5 million whatever. We will just vary our service model to take that into account. So the bottom line has to stop the same, whatever.
Mr. Bill.
Similarly, if I can ask a similar question to Mrs. Taylor, that is the impact of the withdrawal of the service from the Westfield Community Centre, which is down as 28,000 in the spreadsheet. I've got concerns, and I have done from the day one, that that's a centre which doesn't get funding from county council or borough council or anybody else, and is struggling. Could outside of this meeting, perhaps I could be given your assessment of the impact of that on that particular centre. And we raised this pretty well. And I'm just looking at the minutes on page 10 of the previous agenda. I was here, and three of us, Sean, myself, and Jeff Welsh, raised our concerns then. When it came to the full council meeting, we found ourselves in some criticism because we were criticised for having mentioned buildings, and yet this afternoon we seem to be talking about buildings almost totally, and yet the savings are mostly for staff. It's a 3 million withdrawal of staff, which I would have thought is going to have the major impact on these services, and I think we really ought to have some assessment about how on earth we're going to deliver the same level of services with which we're obviously not going to do. And so what exactly is going to happen with the 3 million drop in staffing revenue? Could I just raise a couple of parochial points, if I may, Madam Chairman? In the handout we've had this afternoon, what's clear to me is that Hinckley and Bosworth is going to be the most affected area. It comes out top of that universal list, and that's something I hadn't realised, that the area that I try to represent has the most deprived area, presumably, or it wouldn't be at the top of the list. But one thing I have noticed is that Earl Shilton, which is going to lose its centre, I think, looking at this report, is listed there in the heat map, that Sean's called it, as one of the most deprived areas in the county, and that's been known for years. It comes out at the wrong end of all the indices: unwanted teenage pregnancies, health inequalities, social inequalities. It really does always fall at the wrong end of the spectrum. And of course that's one of the reasons that so much effort has been put in by so many of us to try to redress the balance. But I've got concerns that if we are withdrawing services from Earl Shilton, that this is going to leave that community, or that perhaps the deprived part of that community, I should say, in a worse off state than they are now. So I think we ought to. It's not an area I represent, but I'm familiar with it, and I've got concerns that it's an area which needs more attention, not less. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Would you like to come back on that, Jane?
Yeah. So just a number of points. We can have a conversation with you around the impact of Westfield, so we can come back to you with more detail on that. Just the point you've made around staffing versus buildings, I think really importantly, the removal of buildings does not equate to the removal of services. So we, and by taking money out of buildings, means that we are able to retain £700,000 more staffing resource in. So every building that we keep open, we will need to take more money out of staffing. So you'll see that the proposal we're making, as you quite rightly point out, is to remove £3.1 million from our staffing budget, which will have an impact on the number of cases that we can support. So the more buildings we keep open, the more money we will need to take out of staffing, because the bottom line is that we need to make the savings. And it's a really important point that the removal of buildings does not equate to the removal of services. So we already have places in the county that do not have buildings, but we deliver targeted support to those groups of vulnerable families, but we also deliver group work in those localities as well. So and the other point you raise around the amount of universal provision in Hinckley and Bosworth, some of the decisions that we will need to make in taking out staff from a service is making some decisions around the threshold of families that we deliver to. Now, we already don't deliver, we don't deliver those services to universal families. They're run by a very dedicated group of volunteers, and we expect that to continue into the future, where we're able to support those volunteers to continue to deliver universal provision. And the provision that's already delivered by our partners will either be delivered within the buildings going forward or in other venues as well. So the impact of taking staff out will reduce the number of families we can support, but it will mean that we will need to be more targeted in the intervention we deliver and deliver to those most vulnerable families according to need.
Just a very minor point on detail. You mentioned Barwell and Earl Shilton. I just think moving forward, the proposal is that there is a centre at Earl Shilton, but not at Barwell. I think you might have mentioned it the other way around.
Thank you, Mr. Galton.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, quite rightly, most of the discussion so far focus has been on the children's centres, but I do think it's important we don't miss sight of the other element of this, which is the Supporting Leicestershire Families programme, which I know is very dear to Mr. Old particularly, who's been involved in that from the outset. And, you know, I think back to when that was introduced, it was a flagship coalition government policy. Mr. Pickles, I can remember him saying that something had got to be done to turn around the lives of these children who were not getting the support they needed and improve their outcomes. And I can remember that the initial work that we did on that produced early results, and the government was impressed with that. And on the basis of that, I think we were one of the pilots. It was rolled out. And so the paragraph which refers early in the report to paragraph 6, it is, saying that we've been told that the funding for the programme will cease in 2019-20. And at the Cabinet meeting, I think it's true to say, you know, Mr. Old did express deep concern and opposition to that. So presumably we are, through you, Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Old, presumably we are going to try and do something about that. So I'd like to understand first, is it Leicestershire that's losing our support, or is it everywhere in the country that's going to lose their funding for for what was the national programme, wasn't it? It was called Troubled Families. Or are we being singled out again? So I'd like to understand that. And what are we doing to try and convince the people in the Ministry, is it, of Housing and Local Government these days, I think that's what it's called, that actually this is a bad move and it will cause more problems going forward. So that was my first question. The second one is, we refer to the 290 children in the report that will no longer receive any help. What is the response to that? What is the proposal for those children where we're just simply saying, well, if we take this much resource out of the service, we can't do anything about those children? So is that a realistic position as a local authority to have, to say that, I think I put that to the director, please. What is the professional response to 290 children that currently receive help that we're saying if these proposals go through, they won't get it anymore? What are we going to do about those children?
There was a number of questions there. Do you want to...
I'd like Mr. Old, please, to comment on this issue of the government withdrawing the funding and what we can do about that to challenge it.
Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to say that the process has already begun, and I have in front of me a letter to me dated the 17th of November from the Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss MP, thanking me for my letter of the 8th of November to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We've already started the political process to make sure that as far as we can influence the outcome of the government's considerations on the future of the Troubled Families programme. I'll use their terminology, although as you well know I'm not comfortable with it. The reality is, under current proposals, that funding will cease in 2 years' time, and therefore an authority which is properly run, prudently run, has got to cater in its planning, its advanced planning, under the medium-term financial strategy for that prospect. But that doesn't mean that you just sit back and you do nothing. And I can reassure you, it is not peculiar to Leicestershire. It is a national position over that previous programme.
There also was the question of the 290 fewer. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so I think we've a few things I just want to point to is I think the paper, and when we've talked about this previously, is that this is not a path that we would necessarily have chosen to go down in terms of where we are. So it's given the very difficult situation that the council finds itself in and the huge pressures that we're experiencing in other areas of our work. So in looking at the balance that you have to do as an officer is balancing the needs of the whole population of the children and young people that we are having to deal with. And what we've got in certain areas, we've got children with increasingly complex, difficult and challenging needs that we're struggling to meet at the same time. So with a finite budget, so the pressure is on to balance those two elements. I think we've been quite clear in the paper. You've quoted our figure, that was our figure, that we've been open and honest about the impact that this will have on certain families. What we've tried to do with our proposals, as Jane and Chris has talked about earlier, is to mitigate the impact of this as much as we can. The ways we've done that is to integrate services, to reduce some of the management costs and create efficiencies in certain areas. We've also taken the very difficult decision to say that we're going to close 25 centres, and Jane has made the point very eloquently that most of the services we provide are not in those centres. In fact, some of the centres that we're closing, we provide no services in at all at this point in time. And what we've endeavoured to do is to say what we want to do with these cutbacks is to target and get make them the least impact that we can in the most efficient way. And when Troubled Families programme started, Louise Casey, who was the woman who led this, she talked about direct work with families. That's what changes families. Not buildings, direct work. And what the people who do the direct work are the staff. So what we've endeavoured to do in this programme is keep as much staff as we can possible. But there's no way that I could say at the end of this, and the paper says it, that there will not be certain families that previously would have been getting a service who are not going to get a service. It would be untruthful of us to say anything other than that at this point in time. So I hope that sort of addressed your question in some way or another, but happy to take any secondaries.
Well, I'm grateful for that, Chairman, because I mean, in the end, it is a political decision, so the officers are going to do their best with whatever resources that we give them. So I recognise that it's about priorities. So yeah, I take that answer, and I'm grateful to Mr. Old as well for referring to the letter he's received, and we've just got to hope that maybe someone somewhere will realise that actually this is not a sensible move financially or socially to withdraw the whole lot, all the funding and the long-term consequences, because otherwise what was the point of doing this in the first place? What was the point of investing all this resource that we've done, setting up these programs, recruiting staff and putting structures in place? And you know, all the feedback I've had from that, we've had various progress reports to Scrutiny over the years. You know, it's been a success story. If it had absolutely flopped and it wasn't working and those figures were still going up and people weren't engaging, or we were still, you'd understand. But that's not the case. The evidence is that it has it is having an impact. So you kind of wonder then why it gets on the list for being cut. But as I say, in the end, that's a political decision. The final part I just wanted to raise, Chair, is really make sure the committee is aware, because I wasn't aware until I asked Jane this. Many members will benefit from the work that the impact team does, and will have had those as a response to dealing with low-level antisocial behaviour in their divisions. And I asked the question some time ago, realising that the Youth Offending Service was a key part of the review, whether that meant that the impact team is caught by the review. And the answer I got was that it is caught by the review. And I'm disappointed to hear that, because I think it is and in the end it comes back, the officers have got to identify how they're going to make these savings across that whole. I think that project is actually not the same as everything we're talking about. It ought to be funded from somewhere else, and it used to be funded from the Chief Executive's Department not that many years ago, because it hits so many other issues, particularly in relation to working with district councils and community safety and the police and so on and so forth. I mean, the police are going to, if that programme gets drastically slashed, the more pressure it's going to put on the police, no doubt about it. So I just wanted to flag that up to make sure that members are aware that that team is caught within the scope, and that is a real tool that I know that members and district councils and parishes are able to refer into that when the public and local communities are getting really upset about antisocial behaviour and the impact. So again, I would just say to Mr. Old, I know he's taken over that brief fairly recently, to ask you to have another look at this one and perhaps challenge back to the centre, to the corporate centre, to say, really, you ought not to be requiring children and family services to make a saving on the impact team, because it's much wider than that, Chair. And I make that case, and that goes back to the Cabinet to be looked at.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to be clear, the impact team is part of our early help services, and at present there has been no decision made as to whether or not either the level of savings to be taken out of impact, or if any savings will be taken out of impact. But it is part of the youth offending service, and therefore part of the early help services that are being looked at.
Thank you. Dr. Bremner.
When I came to this meeting, I read the documentation. I knew that the savings have to be made. I then listened to the presentation and was much more enlightened. And I think a lot of councillors have asked questions that I was going to ask, so I've received those answers. But what struck me about, and I'll show them if I can. Sorry, there's some scribbles on it already. These 2 pages, there seems to be a dispersal of deprivation in the west of the county. And that might be by its very nature of being rural. And I would like some assurance, although it's not my area, I'd just like some assurance that how you've laid out the hub and spoke, that the dispersal nature of some of the areas are easily accessible. I'd also like to say that I think looking at the graph, although the y-axis doesn't have a label, so I don't know what the numbers mean. The green bars are very high, that's all I'll say. So I'd hope that the universal users of services will input into the consultation because they seem to be by far the greatest users of those services. And yet, apparently, from what you said, are not paying for any of those services in those buildings. So they're my two questions.
Thank you. If I just take the first one around the hub and spokes and dispersal of the areas, if I can just take you back to, sorry, the slide, oh, they've come back. I'll just take you back to, if I just take you back to the location of our children's centres across the county anyway, this is our current children's centre programme. You will note that there is a whole range of areas that aren't already covered by our children's centre programme. So in terms of the future proposed buildings, you'll note that we are proposing the hubs and spokes to be in areas where there's a high density of early help service users. Where there are areas, and obviously in the west of the county, in fact, northwest and certainly Charnwood area, there are a number of areas where there is a high proportion of early help service users. Now, some of them will already not be able to access a children's centre. They will live in areas where there is no children's centre, or neither can they access one. But we already transport service users into areas or deliver outreach in homes. And again, I know I made the point earlier, the majority of the services that we deliver in early help are not delivered in centres, they are delivered in people's homes. And by the nature of the families, often it's really difficult actually for them to get to the centres. And our most vulnerable families are often worked with on a one-to-one basis within their homes. In relation to the next slide with the green blocks, the green blocks represent users, so they represent people who come into our buildings to access what we call our universal services. So these aren't necessarily the families that are as vulnerable or require as intensive support, and certainly they're often the families that are able to take themselves to buildings either through public transport or through driving themselves. So either those universal services will be continued to deliver from the buildings, or they will be delivered from other buildings, which we have no doubt those people will still be able to access the provision. So the universal numbers are high, but those are the service users that actually for some years now Leicestershire County Council Children and Families Early Help Services haven't delivered targeted support to anyway.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from councillors? Sorry.
I just have a comment on what Paul was saying in his last contribution. I think this position being taken on playing off the costs of the service between staff and buildings concerns me. Buildings are not a luxury. For some communities, they're a necessity, not just to provide a base for delivery of services. Please do not neglect the cost of taking away a building from a community that needs it.
Thank you. Come back on that final point, no?
Well, I don't think we are. I mean, what we're trying to do is get a balance here and try to be creative. There's lots of buildings in areas that we can use in different ways creatively, and I think that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, it'd be great if we could keep all of the buildings open, but the reality isn't that we're not in a position to do that. So,
Dr. Bremner.
One thing that has been on my mind all the way through is that we're discussing vulnerable people and we're discussing staff. So the most important aspect of the discussion is how staff access the people, and whether that's in their home, in a building, in a hospital, in a community centre, in a mosque, in a church, in the Gurdwara, it doesn't really matter. As long as the service is provided to the vulnerable person and individual, that is the most important factor.
I think it's best to remember now that this is under consultation, and feedback and suggestions will add to that consultation that's going on for a considerable, I think it's April the 22nd. And I urge people to take part in that consultation. Thank you very much. Right, I'd like to move on to item 12, in-house fostering service, which is on page 63 to 76 in your agenda pack. Sharon Cook, Assistant Director, Children's Social Care, will present the report and answer any questions. Nikki Collins, Head of Service, also joins us for this item. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
The committee have in front of them a detailed report that was requested for us to come and give an overview to the committee of the activity within our fostering service for 2017 and 18. So this outlines the activity around the recruitment and retention of foster carers and is linked to the recent consultation that took place around foster carer fees. Nikki Collins is the Head of Service for Children in Care, so Nikki's going to take you through the detail of the report and then we'll answer any questions.
Thanks, Sharon. Broadly speaking, any activity that we undertake in relation to recruitment of foster carers and adopters relates to Leicestershire County Council's sufficiency duty. And in the easiest terms possible, because it is easy, is that it requires us to have the right number of carers with the right circumstances and skills to meet our children who are a range of ages and have a range of complexity of need. So over the last year, we've been focusing and prioritising activities to ensure that we have the right number of carers. And we've got a 3-year strategy, so we've been doing it for a year, and a follow-on 3-year strategy starting from April. But in the last year, our priorities have been around fostering mainstream recruitment. So these are foster carers who can have our typical children of a range of ages who have skill. All of our foster carers are required to have an above average parenting skill and lifestyles that mean that they can care for the children in an above average way, because these are children who have suffered trauma and need that kind of care. So in the last year we have recruited and approved 14 to date new foster carers, and a further 12 who are going to panel over the next few months. So a significant number of foster carers. We have lost 5 foster carers, but that is significantly lower than we predicted. We predicted a loss of 20 based on the age of our carers and that they would be retiring or leaving us. About 18 months ago, we undertook a little event and we asked those foster carers to join us. The 20 or so per year over the next 3 years that we expected to retire, very few of them said they'd be prepared to carry on fostering. They felt they had done their time and it was time to move on. And we're very fortunate that we have worked very hard with them over the last year, and we have had 5 who have retired or moved on rather than the 20 that we had expected. So that has been a tremendous help to us. I also just want to highlight that mainstream carers can't do everything that we need them to do. So we have introduced a range, and some of them have been long-standing, some of them are new, a range of specialist carers. Specialist carers work either in a particular way because we require them to, and I'll give you some examples, or they work with particular children whose needs are that much more complex than other children, that they need special circumstances, support, skill and training. So our specialist carers, you may have heard to our one-to-one carers. These are carers who come from a range of professional backgrounds. So we have psychologists, we have someone from a probation background, CPN, so child psychiatric nurse, who have given up their careers to become specialist foster carers, and they can only care for one child at a time. They are usually older children, but not necessarily, and they support that child to try and integrate them either back into a family home, or that they step down from residential care or into independent living, like a 16+ provision. But they provide 24-hour support 7 days a week to one child at a very, very high level. We have our parent and child specialist placements. So these are foster carers who welcome not only the child, but the parent or parents into their home and try and support them, try and help them address their parenting skills and their deficits so that the child can return with their parents to the community. We have our out-of-hours service, our foster carers who work at night and over weekends to have children in circumstances that is quite often challenging for children who are coming to care in an emergency basis where we don't know very much about them, don't much about their behaviour, their health, their education. There might be remand children who are referred by the police, so under very difficult circumstances, and our carers do very well under those conditions. We have pathway carers, which is a new provision. We identified that a very large number of our children who are entering residential care or in residential care could leave or could not be admitted, wouldn't have to be admitted if we had carers who are willing to take children who are that much older, so 15 onwards. So children who are 15 can't be placed into our 16 plus provision because it's for 16 plus only, so there was a gap in our provision. So what we've done is started recruiting for foster carers who are able to have older children, children who don't want to have to bond with a parent. They're beyond that. They know that they can't do that, but they do need a home and they do need that bit of additional care that a 16 plus semi-independent provision couldn't provide them. So that recruitment went live this year. And we have our short breaks provision for children and families where there's a disability, and it does what it says. There are families who need breaks, they need opportunity to breathe, rest, do their shopping, pay their bills, because their own children require that level of care that they can't do it when their children are in the home. So those are our specialist provisions, are absolutely essential for our children with more complex needs. I just want to highlight a few other areas in which this paper doesn't address it specifically, but are critical to our sufficiency strategy. One of those is our connected carers. So connected carers are carers who have some kind of affiliation to the child when the child comes into care. It could be a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin. It could also be a teacher, a youth worker who are putting themselves forward to care for that child so that child doesn't have to come into a local authority foster placement. I highlight this area because we set a 3-year target for that team to go from 70 children that they care for to about 117 in 3 years. They reached 100 this year. So they've gone from 70 to caring for 100 children this year, placed with friends and family. That's an incredible achievement for a team who hasn't had a growth in their staffing. The challenge for upcoming years is ensuring that we can support those carers because they have not come into it knowingly from good circumstances, and they not only have to support those children, they have to carry on supporting their daughters, their sons who have lost their children. So they meet the challenge under the most incredible circumstances. The other area that I'd like to highlight for you, 2 last areas, is adoption. So not specifically in this paper, but we have recruited 18 new adopters this year. That's almost the double what we recruited in the previous year. Without our adopters, young children usually, would be staying in foster care for prolonged periods of time. Adopters make an incredible contribution, but I'd also like to highlight that whilst we've also recruited, we've placed 27 these children this year in adoptive placements, and 12 of those we've done through our relationships with voluntary agencies, not on our own but through partnership. And finally, retention. So our foster carers who haven't left us and those who have stayed with us have said that in the last year they've really felt the difference in the level of support that we are providing them. So one of our strategies over the upcoming year will be to ensure that Leicestershire's unique selling points are used. Our foster carers tell us they get a level of support that they don't believe they would get in other areas. The independent fostering agencies who are asking foster carers who are asking to transfer us are saying they're transferring to us because they hear about the incredible support and training that we offer our foster carers, and that they hear that we listen. And the survey that is in the report is an opportunity, or is an example of the kind of listening we do with our foster carers. So when they tell us they don't have enough training in a certain area, we respond. When they tell us they don't have enough peer support opportunities, we respond. And that message is getting out there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very positive presentation on adoption and fostering. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you. I think you've touched on both of these points, but retention is extremely important when we're investing all this time in recruiting and training foster carers. We want to keep them for as long as we possibly can until they retire, as you've mentioned. You mentioned about the short break carers, but are they specifically just for children with disabilities? Because the feedback I get from sitting on the fostering panels is that mainstream carers and connected carers sometimes just need a little bit of a break and a bit of respite, but then they're just dealing with difficult children or a large amount of children with their own birth children. So is there somewhere, and that seems to be where they leave the service, or they have a break and don't come back to it because they've not had that support and that just that little break that they need in mainstream. Is that something that's within this or not?
Not for short break. Short break is specific. Through this consultation that's been running over the last 2 months around the fees, one of the things that our foster carers have told us is that there isn't enough opportunity for short breaks. The same kind of short breaks that respite that families with disabled children get. And they're talking quite pragmatically about whether or not there can be a daycare scheme, whether or not there can be opportunities where, like during the holidays, where the children go for play schemes so that the carers have a break. So we've taken that on board, and that will be one of our priorities this year, is to increase our respite opportunities, not necessarily other foster carers or overnight breaks, but opportunities that allow foster carers just to be able to do the same thing as families with a disabled child.
I think that's really important, and I'm glad that is part of moving forward, that we need to retain these people, and they do need a rest sometimes, even if it is just for a few hours, just to go and have a coffee somewhere and a bit of peace and quiet. So I'm really pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there something specifically that you have done about the connective, put my glasses on, connective carer? So, because it's gone up so much in such a short time, is there something specific you've done to encourage that?
The long and the short of it is we've spent more money, which has not been easy in a budget that's already stretched and difficult to manage, but it has been a priority for us because we recognise that where children can stay with their families and friends and within their communities, it's the first and right option for them. So what we've done is we've allocated money to ensure that where these referrals come through to our team from the locality or from the court for us to consider a family, we have the assessors to be able to go out and assess these family members. So we've had to stretch that pot of money in that team to ensure we do that. How we've done that is we've not recruited more staff, we've used external assessors to do that, because quite often these carers live all over the country, and then it is easier for that assessor, if they live locally, to be able to undertake that assessment for us. So we've had to be quite flexible and quite creative and very careful with our Leicestershire resource. So the ones that are here, try and keep them local, assessing families that are here, and using casual or external assessors for families who live further afield, sometimes abroad.
Thank you very
Chair,
much.
sorry, I'd just add to that is not only the activity within this part of the service, it's the ethos across the whole of the service, that if children and young people need to come into our care, we will work extremely hard to identify significant extended family members for those children to live with. So the two parts of that ethos are working together around our permanent strategy.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think the report needs to note that the positive future of the fostering service. Thank you. Pressing it off. Moving on to item 13, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Strategy, 2017 to 2020, which is on page 77 and 102 of your agenda pack. Jane Moore, Assistant Director of Education and Early Help, will present the report and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this report is to consult with the committee on the Special Educational Needs and Disability Strategy from 2017 till 2020. So just by way of background, the strategy that is attached to the report sets out how partnerships, partners across Leicestershire plan to support children and young people with SEND aged between 0 and 25 to achieve their best possible outcomes. And this has been done in line with the SEND reforms recently and also in light of the current local position, other local developments. The implementation of the SEND strategy will be monitored through the SEND Strategic Board, which reports to the Children and Families Partnership Board. And the strategy is underpinned by a detailed work plan that does set out a number of work streams. So if I can take you to page 78, just to go through the priorities within the strategy. We've set out 4 key priorities in the strategy. The first of which is to improve multi-agency working and coordination of services for children with special educational needs and disabilities. The second priority is around improving support for and involvement of parents and carers and children and young people, and also to ensure that they are adequately safeguarded in all settings. The third priority is around improving the quality and sufficiency of our SEND education provision and services, and we intend to do that in 2 ways. Firstly, by supporting mainstream schools and settings to develop their SEND provisions and enable children to remain within mainstream setting. But the second area is to develop our local specialist provision to ensure that we not only have sufficiency of places across Leicestershire, but we also have a really good high quality provision across a continuum of needs for children and young people. And then the last priority is around improving the transition to adulthood for those children that require ongoing support into adult services as well. So we've done a whole raft of work in devising the strategy and developing the strategy, and we've detailed that within the strategy. So we've had a lot of feedback from children and young people with SEND and their families, and we've done that through frontline practitioners working with them. And we've also consulted our staff, we've consulted with partners and others in the development of this strategy. And that's what's informed the development of our 4 key priorities as well. So the Voices That Matter section of the strategy does then summarise the key messages that those families have given. So the priorities are underpinned by a number of actions and areas of work that we need to take forward and will be delivered through the SEND board. Just to end in terms of next stages, this strategy has been to the SEND board and it is due to go to Cabinet in May for final approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just wanted to pick up on page 93 and what the Assistant Director just said. So there we can see the list of things that are not working well, and many of them are very familiar. Timely reviews for the EHC process, and I know as a school governor, often it comes up again, well, you know, we triggered this process and we haven't had anything back, and we haven't had a date for the next review meeting, and so on and so forth. So I hope one of the outcomes of this, and I know it is resource hungry, but I just want to make those points that you just recognise these things coming up as to what parents and schools comment on continuously. Bullying is another one that comes up again, incidents in schools. Mental health, well, we all know about that. And of course the continuing need for multi-agency input, where we can't engage all the partners and parents having to deal with multiple agencies who actually they just want one point of contact, and that's what the EHCP process was supposed to deliver, and yet we're still talking 5 years on about the things not working so well. But I did want to say how pleased I am to mention this local specialist provision, and that we're moving ahead on that, because I can remember not this director, not the one before that, which is 10 years ago, saying we need to do something about specialist local provision. And it was largely, I have to say, financially driven, because members were getting more and more frustrated at the very, very high costs of out-county specialist education needs provision. You know, we were having to fly people on a Monday morning up to Northumberland and so on at one point. And the costs, and it just did not seem a sensible use of money. And the answer was, we didn't have that expertise locally. We didn't have the ability to do that. So if we're moving ahead now, and I would like to hear a little bit more about that. Are we talking about commissioning something, or are we talking about actually setting up something within the local authority under our own management, if you like? You know, what's the timescale? When do you think we'll be able to open the doors on localist specialist provision? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. So just going back to your first point about the points that have been raised about what's not working well, these points have come through loud and clear, not just from our frontline practitioners as detailed on page 93, but from families with whom we're working. And the SEND strategy is set out to talk about how as a partnership we will work more effectively with children and families. But actually as a department we've also taken a number of steps around certainly investing in our SENA service in order to improve our work around education, health and care plans. So we know that we do really well in terms of getting those plans out on time, but we are working to improve the quality of those plans in partnership with children and their families as well. In relation to the development of localised specialist provision, we have a wealth of expertise within the county. We have 6 good and outstanding special schools. We have a whole raft of mainstream provision that is incredibly expertise in working with children with special educational needs and disabilities. And we've had a really positive response from our colleagues in the education sector to develop localised provision. So when we talk about localised provision, we're talking about developing resource bases within our mainstream schools that can support those children that could be successful within a mainstream setting but with additional support. And the benefit of that is primarily that those children will be able to go to a local setting. So we won't need to be transporting them around the county, but they will be able to access a provision within their local area. We do know that our costs are high in terms of the spend around independent provision, but actually we think that if we can develop localised provision with best outcomes for children, then the cost will come down as well. So we do have a raft of expertise both within the local authority and within our both mainstream and special provision, and our education colleagues have been working really proactively with us. So in terms of timescales, we have 3 new resource bases that will be ready in the spring, this next term coming up, or September, for children with higher functioning ASD or autism spectrum, and we are looking now at developing our provision for those children with social, emotional and mental health issues, and again we're doing that in partnership with schools across the county.
Thank you. Mrs Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things I think are most important is your priority 4, which is the transition to adulthood. I think spending all that time and effort getting a child through education as best you can for them to fall off the cliff when they hit adulthood because there's nothing there for them is really important. So I am pleased to see that in there, and I hope that does progress. But what can you actually do to support these children? Because what we want them to do eventually is to move into employment or voluntary work or something worthwhile for them. You know, the responses you've got in for parents is that even with modern learning difficulties, they still have trouble accessing training or employment. So I'll be keen to hear what the plans are for that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, all children will transition into adulthood. So part of the work that we need to be doing with all children is preparing for adulthood. Some children will need to transition into adult services for continued support. But really importantly is the development of suitable provision to meet outcomes for children post-16 or post-19 as well. So we're doing a number of things. We're working very closely with colleagues within our adult services to make sure that where children do need to transition into adult services, that transition happens well and continues to meet those children's needs into adulthood. But again, we're also working to develop a range of provision so that through outcomes-based assessment, so working with those children and families to look at what outcomes they want to meet later on in life, we can develop a whole range of provision to meet those needs. So we already have some really good post-16 provision within the county. What we want to do is work with our colleagues to develop a whole range of provision so that young people can make choices about what they do post-16 or post-19.
Mr Sheehan.
Yeah, I think going back to this list on page 93, the two lists on page 93, I think there's one thing that if we got right, we'd sort an awful lot of this out, and that is inclusion. It shouldn't be a matter of political debate. It should be a philosophical principle that we all adhere to. We should be leading the rest of society in the drive for better inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very quick statement. So.
Well, it's an invitation to agree with me, but I mean, you can take it as a statement.
Mr. Auld.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I disagree with Sean on principle anyway, because I enjoy the subsequent debate that we have together. Doesn't necessarily mean I don't agree with him. I just enjoy the choss. We are at a certain point in time, and my mind has gone back 2 years to when we opened Bungalow 66 for older children with Asperger's syndrome. And Maplewell Hall has now got a unit of 20 places for people with Asperger's syndrome. So it's evolutionary all the way through. What the report doesn't tell you is that when there's reference to the SEND board, that I have dug my heels in and said that I intend being an active member of the board. So in addition to the people mentioned in the report, I will also be present at board meetings. I'm very conscious of my post bag, which if I removed everything to do with SEN would mean it would be almost invisible, and isn't. And therefore, I think because we're held accountable as elected members, it's important that an elected member is actually on that board and able to take in quite a different perception to the discussion that takes place.
Yes, Mr. Meredith.
Yes, Sean, I do agree with you in terms of inclusion. I think it's an important principle that we all aspire to, especially if you're going to look at the whole life for children who become adults, as we've talked about, is that they have to promote as much integration as possible. Just want to say a couple of things about the report. It is an honest appraisal in terms of where we are. That's why we've got those three elements in it. And any good strategy, it seems to me, you have to do an honest appraisal in terms of where you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are if you're going to move forward to achieve your aspirations. So that's what this report outlines. There are some big challenges for us. I think it's a good strategy about how we're moving forward, and as Jane and Councillor Auld has just outlined, we can already see there are some really good, strong green shoots that are starting to emerge about these new units that we're actually setting up locally to develop our local offer to keep people within the county of Leicestershire. And I'm pleased that Councillor Auld mentioned Maplewell, because you know we're in a difficult place with Maplewell in terms of other service provision, but I think that does show our commitment to the school in the sense of moving forward, that you know that school still has a place for us, and that unit is evidence of the kind of things about how we need to move forward in the council.
I'd like to agree with Councillor Sheehan that inclusion is important, and the best example I can think of is the inclusion of Down syndrome children into the community. And I think that has been something that is really, I'm going to use the word blessed, a town in South Leicestershire. But I wanted to go to page 92 as well to give a different spin to the problems. And one highlighted to me there was the phrase, EHC plans are issued in timescale. So clearly this is a mixed bag in experience. There's something that's very positive about the plans, and there's also something very negative, and I think you have to take both sides of that coin and not just look at one. Thank you.
Yes, Jane.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, we know that we've done really well in terms of not just issuing EHCPs within timescale, but converting them from statements. However, as you've seen from what's not working well, is that we know we've got a long way to go in terms of co-producing those plans with families and making sure they're of quality. But absolutely, we're on the right journey, and we know what work we need to do to continue that journey.
Thank you. I think we note and the policy. Thank you very much. We go on to item 14, fire safety in Leicestershire maintained schools and academy. And Paul Meredith, Director of Children and Families, and David Atterbury will be presenting the report and answer any questions. Thank you.
I'm just going to kick this off and set the scene a bit, and David will go through in terms of any of the detail. I think in reading this report you can see, in one sense you might well think, you know, it's a relatively straightforward issue, but I think what this report actually highlights is the complexity of actually what we have to do in the environment that education is being delivered at present in Leicestershire with a large number of academies, and how we work with those academies to deliver that agenda. I think the important thing about this report is about how proactive we've been following Grenfell disaster to actually go out there and check on the safety and well-being of children and young people in Leicestershire, and that's been the big driver behind everything that we've done. Within the powers that we have, the limited powers we have as a county council, our main concern is that children and young people in Leicestershire are as safe as they possibly can be in the situation. That's why we proactively went out and actually collected information from academies. We didn't give up when we didn't get a good response the first time. We were persistent, and on the back of that we've now collected a lot better information, and I would say probably better information than maybe the Department for Education has, although don't quote me on that. But so I think that is a good example of setting our priorities right, and obviously we will continue to monitor the situation as we move forward. So I'm going to stop at that point. I don't know if there are any particular things you want to get into a bit more detail, David.
If I may please, Chair, just add to that. As Paul has outlined, this paper really is about showing that all Leicestershire schools, irrespective of their type, are compliant with current fire safety regulations as we know them. Post the Grenfell tragedy, there was a considerable amount of interest in fire safety in public buildings. With that in mind, the DFE wrote directly to academies and to the diocese seeking information, but at the same time wrote to the LA. However, the DFE would not share the information they collated with the LA, other than to say that we believe that academies are safe. We took a view subsequent to that whilst academies may be responsible for their own school buildings, the pupils that occupy those buildings are part of the LA, and we have a duty in terms of their safety and well-being. So as Paul suggests, we have sought to find information from every school. It has taken time to do it. Paragraphs 18 to 25 outline the work that has been done and the 3 attempts that we had to get the information. But the headline point there, as outlined in para 24, is that we now have 100% response. What that 100% response shows us is that all Leicestershire schools are compliant with current fire safety regulations. However, there is more work to be done. And that work basically concerns some of the documentation that we've come across in doing our work. Just moving on, since 2008 it has been practiced to install sprinkler systems in all new build schools or significant extensions to schools in Leicestershire, except of course where a risk assessment shows that may not be necessary. However, in the light of Grenfell and in the expected light of the report that's coming from Dame Judith Hackett about Grenfell, we expect that the DFE will want to revise their policy, and accordingly it's timely for the local authority to have in place a clear policy on fire safety. So that is work that is now in progress. Just to finish up, paragraphs 33 to 37 outline the new build schools, the 9 schools that have taken place in Leicestershire over the last 9 years, or 8.5 years. It should be noted that all except 2 include sprinkler systems, and those 2 have been clearly risk assessed. They will be reviewed again once we have a revised risk assessment and policy in place. However, I would draw your attention to paragraph 38. There are 4 schools in Leicestershire that are now having rebuilds as part of a government-funded initiative called Priority Schools Build Programme 2. We have some interesting conversations playing out with the Education Skills and Funding Agency at the moment about the requirement for sprinklers in those new build schemes. They are trying to pass responsibility back to the local authority, and we are saying it is their projects and they need to get on with it. Things are still progressing on that front. Clearly, sitting behind all of this, there are significant resource implications to the installation of sprinkler systems dependent on how government changes policy. It isn't possible at this stage to say exactly how much and when. However, what I would say, and just to finalise in terms of Paul's comments, is as a local authority we have done a heck of a lot, and much more than others, to confirm that all Leicestershire schools are now safe. There is more work in progress, and this is actually now taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a question on 37. It's the school at Lubbersthorpe is being built with the 106 obligations, and it says that officers have requested that the school incorporates a sprinkler system. Is that what we do now, just request? Can't we demand or say that that's the way it is and do it?
or else no one gets to go to school. Sorry, it is a bit more complex than that, particularly where Lubbersthorpe is concerned, because Lubbersthorpe is the first school in Leicestershire that is being built directly by the landowners and then passed back to the local authority. But in effect, it passes to our hands and goes straight to an academy. So you could say it's never really our school. So what we're trying to do is to coerce and influence, but we can't say we want this doing or else. If we push too hard, they'll just turn around potentially and say, well, you fund the cost of it, whatever it may be. What I would say, though, is that the landowners for Lubbersthorpe, and we've just started the process to invite expressions of interest on this new school today, but the landowners are working very proactively with us, and I'm sure they'll be compliant.
Mr. Jennings.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. Congratulations on your appointment. I hope that future reports will have Aspedillazu spelt correctly, but apart from that, you've done very well. I must comment on the section, paragraph 38, which which mentions the Countersup Leyland Academy, which is in my division, and this is the first I've heard of it. I'm here making a guest appearance this afternoon on behalf of an absent member, and as the local member, I would hope to be kept informed of developments, because if word gets out, it is going to be of concern to people, and I've not been told anything.
If I may just answer that, Chair. My apologies for that, Mr. Jennings. I'd emphasise the point, though, this is not a local authority school rebuild. It's been done directly by the ESFA, and just as you express surprise, we from time to time express surprise that they don't share information with us, but I will ensure that you are kept briefed on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mrs. Page.
Certainly a success story, and really, really pleased that we've got 100% compliance. I mean, that's absolutely wonderful. Can you just outline your future policy you're formulating? You know, what do you see set within that? And going back to Chairman's point, will this incorporate, you know, a stipulation, because we will have a lot of schools being built via the Section 106 process with all the pending development. So
it's times like this I wish I was an architect or a building surveyor. In terms of the policy, it will set out a level of expectancies, both in terms of new builds and significant expansion of schools. It will talk about the type of systems, it will talk about how they might operate, but it will also talk about other fire safety measures. And as a policy, it will state our expectancy. Now, sitting behind this, of course, is that anyone who comes onto an academy site now needs a licence from the local authority to come onto that site to do work. If developers are not keen to work with us, then we have the ultimate big stick, which is to withhold the licence to do the work. Now, of course, we're striking a fine balance, because in effect we may turn away significant investment to Leicestershire in maintaining our principles, but it will, I'm sure, that the policy that is be brought back to scrutiny once it's available in the early summer.
Early summer, did you say?
I do understand, though, that sprinkler systems are only one aspect of fire safety. Fire safety can be built in to a building, and it doesn't necessarily just rely on sprinklers. So, thank you very much. Are there any more questions on this? Yes.
Well, I did just want to say, I mean, Grenfell was an awful tragedy, but I think the council, Kensington and Chelsea, were also criticised for the way they handled the aftermath. And I'd just like to hear some assurance that at a corporate level, we are preparing the authority to deal with a situation like this. God forbid it should ever arise, but we need to make sure that as an authority we are able to respond appropriately in case of the worst happening.
I mean, we do have contingency plans in place for all those kind of situations. I think we had a difficult situation that occurred quite recently in the last few weeks. I know it was in the city, but it had some ramifications for us, and I think we're able to respond positively to that. So I think we feel confident that if this situation did arise, that we'd be in a good position to deal with it.
Right, any more questions? No? We have a pink paper here on the free early education entitlement for the committee to note. Right, the next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Monday the 4th of June 2018 at 1:30. I'm saying that just to make sure that people have listened to it, but it's 1:30. As I said earlier, there are no urgent items. Any other items which the chairman has decided to take as urgent? Oh, yes, sorry.
I just wanted to say something about the pink paper. I know it's just for information. It's very quick, but I just wanted to highlight, I'm sure you'll read the paper at your leisure, but this is a good news story for Leicestershire as well. I think most of you may have read in the press about the difficulties of this system operating all over the country. Leicestershire was a pilot for this, and we've really succeeded and achieved all our targets. So I think it's another area where we should recognise the really good work that our staff have done in actually delivering this service.
Thank you. I think we saw it in the earlier presentation. I think it was 88%. Yes, if I remember rightly. Thank you very much for coming. Good night.